The dust in the basement of the Bibliothèque Nationale doesn't settle, it hovers, suspended in a permanent state of agitation, as if the very air is trying to reject the presence of the intruder. I found it there, tucked between a ledger of Napoleonic grain taxes and a collection of amateur botanical sketches, a geography primer dated 1842. It was a standard instructional text for the sons of the French elite, yet it contained a cartographic heresy that modern academia insists never existed. On page 47, the map of the Asian interior does not show the fragmented Kanates or the empty Siberian wastes we are taught to expect. Instead, it displays a monolithic entity stretching from the Caspian to the Pacific, labelled in bold, authoritative script as Grand Tartaria. By 1874, this name had vanished, not just from this specific series of primers, but from the global pedagogical consciousness. Ask yourself how a landmass larger than the Roman Empire at its zenith simply evaporates from the collective memory of the Western world within a single generation. It was not a slow decline, it was not a gradual rebranding, it was an institutional erasure so complete that it suggests a coordinated effort of historical revisionism. What if the borders we recognise today are merely the scars left behind after a massive global surgery? We are told that Tartaria was merely a vague geographical term, a shorthand used by ignorant Europeans to describe a wilderness they did not understand. But the maps tell a different story. They show cities, they show trade routes, they show a complex network of load distribution and infrastructure that suggests a highly organised, centralised power, not a wilderness, not a collection of nomadic tribes. Something else. The staccato rhythm of the census reports from the mid-19th century reveals a terrifying silence where there should be noise. Between 1850 and 1870, the administrative records of the Eurasian steppe undergo a radical transformation. The terminology shifts. The Tartars, once described as a diverse and technologically capable civilization, are suddenly relegated to the status of primitive heathens. This is the institutional gatekeeping of reality. By changing the language, they change the past. The architectural record offers no sanctuary for the official narrative. If you walk through the streets of San Francisco, Moscow, or Buenos Aires, you will find buildings that share a DNA that defies the supposed technological limitations of their era. Massive stone blocks, intricate decorative motifs, and a specific, recurring focus on atmospheric electricity harvesting. Features that suggest a global architectural style that preceded the rise of our current industrial paradigm. We are told these were built by pioneers with horse-drawn carriages and hand tools, often in the midst of famine or war. Ask yourself if a starving population in the 1870s would prioritize the construction of massive Greco-Roman temples in the middle of a muddy wilderness. What if these structures were not built by the people who claimed them, but were instead inherited? The great world fairs of the late 19th century begin to look less like celebrations of progress and more like the controlled demolition of a previous civilization's remnants. They built temporary cities out of plaster and wood to hide the permanent stone structures beneath, then burned them to the ground once the narrative was secured. Not a fair, not a celebration, a liquidation. The scale of the deception is almost too large to perceive, which is exactly why it works. We are conditioned to look at the small details, the individual dates and names, while the massive, glaring pattern remains invisible in plain sight. The erasure of Tartaria from the 1874 textbooks was the final seal on a tomb. It was the moment the victors stopped hiding the evidence and started rewriting the laws of physics and history to ensure the evidence could no longer be understood. Consider the mud. In almost every major city across the globe, there is a visible phenomenon that geologists and historians ignore with a practiced institutional blindness: the buried first floors, windows that dip below the pavement line, doors that lead into the earth, and subterranean levels that possess the grand ornamentation of a main entrance. The official explanation is sloping streets or drainage management, but the pattern is global. From the streets of Omaha to the centres of Prague, the earth seems to have risen by several meters in a very short period. This is the mud flood hypothesis, a concept dismissed by mainstream academics as a digital fever dream. Yet the physical evidence is undeniable. If you look at the photographs from the 1860s, the cities are eerily empty. Why are there no people in the streets of Paris or New York in the earliest daguerreotypes? We are told the exposure times were too long, that moving figures were blurred into invisibility. But why are there no horses? Why are there no carts? Why does the infrastructure look weathered and ancient, even when it is supposedly brand new? The suspicion grows that we are the second-hand tenants of a world we did not build. We are the inheritors of a silent planet, scrubbing the names off the monuments and replacing them with our own. The 1874 curriculum shift was the moment the squatters became the owners. It was the year they stopped being guests in the ruins and started pretending they were the architects. The technological leap of the late 19th century is often framed as a triumph of human ingenuity, but the sudden appearance of complex systems like the telegraph and the steam engine feels more like a staged rollout of suppressed knowledge. In the archives of the patent offices, one finds a graveyard of inventions that suggest a much cleaner, more efficient understanding of energy than the coal-burning filth we were eventually sold. The works of Tesla are only the tip of a very deep and very dark iceberg. There are hints of a global power grid, a wireless system that utilized the very ionosphere to provide energy to the masses. The star forts, those massive, geometrically perfect stone structures found on every continent, were not defensive fortifications. They were energy hubs. Their symmetry is not tactical, it is functional. When you look at the layout of a star fort from above, it resembles a circuit board more than a castle. Ask yourself why every major star fort in the world was either converted into a prison, a park, or destroyed during the 19th century. They were neutralizing the nodes of the old grid. They were cutting the wires of the previous tenant's house before moving in. Not defense, not war, management. The institutional gatekeepers will tell you that the Tartarian Empire is a myth born of poor translation, but they cannot explain why the French military maps of 1780 listed Tartaria as a sovereign state with its own flag, its own emperor, and its own standing army. The disappearance of a culture is usually a messy affair. There are refugees, there are resistance movements, there are cultural echoes that persist for centuries, but Tartaria went quiet with a surgical precision that is haunting. By the time the 1874 textbooks were printed, the children of the world were being taught a history that had no room for a centralized Eurasian superpower. They were taught about the great game between Britain and Russia, a narrative that framed the entire region as a vacant lot to be fought over by the new powers. This is the classic erasure trope. Turn a civilization into a vacancy. If the land is empty, your conquest is not a crime, it is a service. The civilizing mission of the 19th century was the mask worn by the gravediggers. They spent decades scouring the records, burning the libraries, and systematically dismantling the physical evidence of the old world. What we call history is merely the curated debris of a much larger, much older story that we are no longer allowed to read? What if the Dark Ages weren't in the past, but are actually the period we are living in now, a period of profound amnesia enforced by a global administrative class? Think about the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported from the east coast of the United States to the rural Midwest and West. The official story is one of charity, rescuing street urchins from the squalor of the cities. But where did these thousands of children come from? Why was there such a sudden, massive surplus of parentless youth in every major Western city at exactly the same time? If you look at the records, many of these children were not orphans at all, but were taken from families deemed unfit by the state. This looks less like social work and more like a repopulation program, a reset. You take the children, you strip them of their names, you erase their heritage, and you give them a new history. You place them in the empty cities, tell them their ancestors were primitive savages, and watch as they build a world based on the lies you fed them. The 1874 textbooks were the instruction manuals for this new generation of amnesiacs. They were the scripts for a play where the actors don't know they're on a stage. Not charity, not migration, engineering. The silence of the archives is not a vacuum. It is a presence. It is a weight that presses down on the researcher who dares to look for the gaps. When I asked the curator at the British Museum about the discrepancies in the Scythian exhibits, the reaction was not one of academic curiosity, but of immediate, defensive hostility. This is the institutional reflex. The gatekeepers don't need to know the truth. They only need to know what isn't allowed to be true. The academic consensus is a fence built around a hole in the ground. They tell you there's nothing there, even as they spend billions of dollars making sure you don't jump in to check. What are they hiding in the basements of the Smithsonian? Why are the depths of the Vatican Library off limits to all but the most vetted scholars? The erasure of Tartaria was the first great success of the modern propaganda machine. It proved that you could delete a continent from the human mind if you controlled the schools and the printing presses. If you control the past, you control the future. If you control the map, you control the destination. We are told that the Industrial Revolution was a period of frantic invention, but the more one investigates, the more it looks like a period of frantic excavation. The heavy machinery of the 1800s was not designed to build a new world. It was designed to dig out the old one. The canals that crisscross the United States and Europe, supposedly dug by men with shovels, are masterpieces of hydroengineering that often run perfectly straight for hundreds of miles, ignoring the topography of the land. They are part of a global water management system that predates the countries that claim to have built them. The railroad tracks were laid over existing routes that had already been levelled and graded by a civilization with a much more sophisticated understanding of load distribution. We are walking in the footprints of giants and calling ourselves tall. The 1874 textbooks were the final step in this process of cultural gaslighting. They taught us to look at the ruins and see progress. They taught us to look at the chains and see freedom. The pattern is not limited to geography or architecture. It extends into the very biology of our existence. The late 19th century saw the rise of institutionalized medicine, the systematic suppression of traditional healing, and the birth of the pharmaceutical industry. This was the same period that saw the final erasure of Tartaria. Is it a coincidence that the same powers that rewrote our history also took control of our bodies? By severing our connection to the past, they also severed our connection to the natural world and its hidden energies. They turned us into consumers, passive entities that rely on the state for both our identity and our survival. Ask yourself why the history of Tartaria is so often linked to legends of giants, advanced metallurgy, and a deep understanding of the Earth's resonant frequencies. What if the myth of Tartaria is actually a memory of a more evolved state of being? Not a kingdom, not a country, a different way of existing. As we reach the end of this investigation, we are left not with answers, but with a profound and unsettling sense of displacement. The 1874 textbooks did their job well. They created a world that feels solid, logical, and inevitable. But once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. Once you notice the buried windows, the empty streets, and the missing empires, the official narrative begins to dissolve like sugar in water. We are left standing in a landscape of ghosts, trying to reconstruct a puzzle when half the pieces have been burned. The mystery of Tartaria is not just a mystery of history, it is a mystery of us. Who are we, really? Where did we come from? And who are the people who spent so much time and effort making sure we would never find out? The search for Tartaria is the search for our own stolen inheritance. It is a journey into the heart of a darkness that was manufactured to keep us from seeing the light. The question remains, hanging in the air like the dust of the Bibliothèque Nationale. What else have they taken from us while we were busy learning their lessons? The 1874 shift was not merely a change in geography, it was a fundamental recalibration of human resonance. Before this chronological fracture, the world operated on a different frequency, literally and figuratively. When we examine the grand pipe organs of the great cathedrals, structures that are often far older and more complex than the ecclesiastical histories suggest, we find instruments capable of producing infrasound and ultrasound frequencies that affect the human nervous system at a cellular level. These were not built for hymns. They were acoustic healers, part of a global network of vibrational technology that the Tartarian civilization mastered. By 1874, the tonal memory of the populace was being systematically dismantled. The introduction of standard concert pitch, a movement that gained institutional momentum in the late 19th century, was a stifling of the natural harmonic resonance of the earth. Ask yourself why every ancient culture from the steppes to the Andes utilized specific frequencies that align with the mathematical constants of nature, only for those frequencies to be declared primitive or out of tune by the Victorian academic establishment. They didn't just take the land, they took the air. They colonized the very space between our thoughts. This was the silent war of 1874, a conflict fought not with cannons, but with tuning forks and textbooks. Consider the star forts once more, but look closer at their placement relative to the Earth's telluric currents. These are not random strategic positions. They sit atop the ley lines, the literal nervous system of the planet. In the 1874 curriculum, these structures were redefined as tres Italienne fortifications, credited to Renaissance engineers who supposedly obsessed over geometric aesthetics for the sake of defensive fields of fire. But what if the fire wasn't gunpowder? What if these were capacitors? The heavy use of mercury in the foundations of many of these sites, often discovered during modern renovations and promptly classified by environmental agencies, suggests a conductive purpose. Mercury, the red liquid of the alchemists, was the lifeblood of the Tartarian energy grid. By 1874, the institutional gatekeeping had moved to replace this free atmospheric energy with a metered, dirty alternative fossil fuels. not progress, not innovation, enclosure. They fenced in the sky and sold us the smoke. The staccato beat of the steam engine was the heartbeat of a new artificial era, designed to drown out the hum of the old world. The erasure of the Tartarian linguistic root is perhaps the most subtle and effective tool of the 1874 revisionists. Before the mid-19th century, the root tar appeared in the names of mountains, rivers, and dynasties across the globe, from the Tarim Basin to the Tartessos of Spain. It was a signifier of a specific lineage, a global caste of builders and navigators. After 1874, these connections were severed. Linguists were tasked with categorizing these terms into isolated, unrelated language families. They broke the mirror, so we would only see the shards. Ask yourself how Tartary could be a major sovereign entity on the maps of the 1850s, complete with its own diplomatic protocols, and by 1874 be dismissed as a misunderstanding of the word Tatar. This is the pseudo-academic language of the victors. It is the rhythmic repetition of a lie until the lie becomes the foundation of the truth. We are told that the Tartarians were nomadic, yet their ruins are monolithic. We are told they were illiterate, yet their architecture is a symphony of geometric mathematics, not nomadic, not illiterate, something else. The 1874 textbooks also introduced a new concept of time, the linear progressive timeline of the industrial age. Before this, the human experience of time was cyclical, connected to the great celestial movements and the great year of the precession of the equinoxes. The Tartarian civilization lived in harmony with these cycles, utilizing the massive astronomical clocks found in cities like Prague and Strasbourg, clocks that are often older than the buildings they inhabit, to track the shifting energies of the cosmos. The 1874 reset forced us into a factory time, a fragmented, urgent existence where the past is always primitive and the future is always better. This creates a permanent state of dissatisfaction and amnesia. If the past is inferior, why look back? If the people of the 1840s were just uncivilized, then their disappearance doesn't matter. But if they were more advanced than us, spiritually, technologically, and harmonically, then our entire modern existence is a regression. What if we are living in the ruins of a golden age, convinced by our school books that we are the peak of evolution? The institutional erasure of 1874 required a physical cleanup of unprecedented proportions. This is where the great fires of the 19th century come into play. Chicago, 1871. Boston, 1872. Seattle, 1889. The list is exhaustive. In every case, a young city, supposedly built of wood, and is consumed by an inferno so hot that it melts stone and iron, temperatures that a simple cow kicking over a lantern could never produce. And in every case, the reconstruction that follows is miraculously fast, resulting in grand stone-clad cities that look suspiciously like the ones that were just destroyed. What if the fires were not accidents, but controlled demolitions of the Tartarian infrastructure that could not be repurposed? What if they were burning the evidence of the old world to make room for the modern facades? The 1874 textbooks then codified these events as tragedies of poor urban planning, rather than the calculated liquidations they likely were. Not accidents, not tragedies. Arson. Look at the photography of the era again, but focus on the restoration projects. We see images of the Great Sphinx in Egypt buried up to its neck in sand, or the ruins of Rome half submerged in earth. We are told these are the results of centuries of neglect, but look at the dates. Many of these photographs were taken just before or after the 1874 shift. The excavations were often rebranding exercises. They weren't discovering these sites, they were reclaiming them. They were digging the old world out of the mud of the recent catastrophe, the same mud that fills the basements of our current cities, and slapping a new narrative on top. This is the contrast of scale that the 1874 revisionists couldn't quite hide. The sheer massive size of the ancient blocks compared to the puny bricks used by the 19th century restorers. Ask yourself why we cannot replicate the precision of the old world masonry today, despite our advanced technology. What if the tools they used weren't hammers and chisels, but sound and vibration? The institutional gatekeepers of 1874 also had to deal with the biological evidence of the Tartarian people. If Tartaria was a global empire, its people must have been diverse, yet united by specific genetic markers. This is perhaps the darkest chapter of the 1874 reset. The rise of eugenics and the rigid classification of races in the late 19th century served to fragment the global Tartarian population into warring factions. They taught us to see otherness where there was once oneness. They used the census to categorize and isolate, ensuring that the descendants of the old world would never realize their shared heritage. The orphan trains were the logistics of this fragmentation. By separating the children from their history, they ensured the Tartarian line would be diluted into the new, controllable identities of the modern states. Not race, not ethnicity. Management. The 1874 textbooks also saw the introduction of a new kind of science, one that was strictly materialistic and disconnected from the ether. The ether was the medium through which Tartarian technology operated, a subtle energy field that connects all things. By 1874, the scientific community began to move toward the Michelson-Morley experiment and the eventual rejection of the ether. This was not a scientific discovery, it was a tactical withdrawal. By declaring the ether non-existent, they made the Tartarian technology impossible. If the medium doesn't exist, the device that uses it must be a myth. This is the ultimate form of gaslighting, to tell someone that the very air they breathe is a fantasy. It forced us to rely on the limited entropic physics of the combustion engine and the light bulb, keeping us tethered to the power lines and the fuel pumps of the new masters. As the investigator, I find myself standing in the middle of a city that feels less like a home and more like a museum of things I'm not allowed to understand. The 1874 textbooks are the labels on the display cases, telling me what to think about the artifacts I see. But the artifacts themselves, the star forts, the buried windows, the grand cathedrals, speak a different language. They speak of a world that was interconnected, vibrant, and free. They speak of a civilization that didn't need to burn the planet to power its lights, and they speak of a loss so profound that our modern minds can barely grasp the scale of it. What if the great reset of the 19th century was just one in a series of many? What if our history is a loop of amnesia programmed into us every time we get too close to the truth? The investigation into 1874 is not just about a missing country on a map. It is about the fundamental nature of our reality. It is about the power of the institutions to define what is real and what is not. It is about the silence that follows the burning of a library. When the 1874 geography primers were distributed, they didn't just teach children about the world, they created the world. They defined the boundaries of the possible and the impossible. They taught us to be small, they taught us to be alone, and they taught us to forget. But the memory is still there, buried in the mud and the stones, waiting for someone to ask the right question. What if the map is wrong? What if the timeline is a lie? What if Tartaria never disappeared, but was simply hidden behind a wall of paper and ink? The open loop remains, a ghost in the machine of our education, a whisper in the halls of the archives. The search continues, because the truth is not in the books, it is in the gaps between the lines. The architectural consistency of the pre-1874 world suggests a global synchronization that defies the slow-moving logistics of the 19th century. When we examine the Capitol buildings of the United States, from the massive dome in Washington to the identical neoclassicism of state houses in the deepest reaches of the Western territories, we are told they are the product of a unified architectural movement. But ask yourself, how did builders in the rugged, undeveloped terrain of Iowa or California, supposedly struggling with the basic survival of the frontier, achieve the same mathematical perfection and load distribution as the master masons of Europe? The official record insists on a timeline of construction that is physically impossible. They claim these massive stone edifices, featuring internal heating systems, complex ventilation, and ornamental copper domes, were erected in mere months. In truth, these structures bear the hallmarks of the Tartarian aesthetic, a civilization that viewed architecture not as a shelter but as a resonator. The domes were not for decoration, they were collectors of atmospheric plasma. The flagpoles atop them were not for flags, they were antennas. By 1874, the textbooks had renamed these functional components as classical revival flourishes, stripping the technology of its purpose and turning it into a costume. Not a building, not a monument, a machine. The institutional erasure of 1874 also required a radical restructuring of the subterranean world. Beneath every major city that allegedly exploded into existence during the Industrial Revolution lies a labyrinth of brick-lined tunnels, vaulted chambers, and massive, arched sewers that far exceed the requirements of the populations they supposedly served. We are told these were built to combat the cholera and filth of the Victorian era, yet the masonry is often superior to the buildings above ground. Why would a society supposedly limited to candlelight and hand shovels invest such immense resources into hidden architectural masterpieces? What if these tunnels were the conduits for the wireless power grid of the old world? What if the sewers were actually the cooling systems or transit tubes for a civilization that moved beneath the mud of the atmospheric reset? The 1874 narrative buried this infrastructure under a layer of bureaucratic labels. They gave us public works to hide the ancient works. The staccato rhythm of the jackhammer in our modern streets is the sound of the new owners trying to patch a system they don't fully understand. Not a sewer, not a subway, a motherboard. Consider the role of the great exhibitions, starting with the Crystal Palace in 1851 and culminating in the global circuit of World's Fairs in the decades following 1874. These events are framed as the debut of the modern world, but the investigative eye sees a massive liquidation sale. The buildings of these fairs, the White City of Chicago, the palaces of St. Louis, were grander than anything we can build today. We are told they were temporary, made of a mixture of plaster and hemp fibre called staff. Ask yourself why anyone would build a functioning electrified city of thousands of acres, complete with massive waterways and heavy stone foundations, only to tear it down 6 months later. What if these were the existing hubs of the Tartarian world, repurposed for a final show? The fairs were a psychological operation designed to introduce the new inventions of the victors, the light bulb, the internal combustion engine, while the spectators stood within the far superior inherited architecture of the losers. When the fairs ended, the buildings were burned or bulldozed, a ritualistic destruction of the evidence, not as fair, not an exhibition, a crime scene. The 1874 shift was also the birth of modern archaeology, a field created not to find the truth, but to manage it. The late 19th century saw the establishment of the great institutional gatekeepers, the Egyptology departments, the Royal Geographical Society, the Smithsonian. Their primary function was to categorize any find that disrupted the new timeline as an out-of-place artifact. If a hammer is found embedded in millions of year old rock, or if a map shows Antarctica without ice, it is discarded. The 1874 textbooks established the standard model of human progress, a slow upward climb from the cave to the cubicle. This model requires that any evidence of a high technology global past be treated as a fantasy. This is the pseudo-academic language of containment. They use words like pseudo-history and conspiracy to trigger a social immune response against the truth. They have turned the quest for our origins into a social taboo. Not a science, not a study, a cage. The erasure of Tartaria is most visible in the Grand Canyon of our own amnesia. In the late 1800s, newspaper reports, before the heavy hand of 1874 censorship fully squeezed the life out of the press, spoke of incredible finds in the American West. They reported on giant skeletons, subterranean cities, and Egyptian-style artifacts found in the caves of the Grand Canyon. Then, the silence. The Smithsonian stepped in, the areas were closed to the public, and the stories were dismissed as yellow journalism. Ask yourself why the most interesting parts of our national parks are restricted for ecological protection. What if they are protecting the narrative, not the nature? The 1874 reset ensured that the Wild West was seen as a blank slate, a vacuum waiting for the railroad. But the railroad was following the existing ley lines of the Tartarian transit system, laying steel over the ghosts of a much faster way to travel. Not a frontier, not a wilderness, a graveyard. The rhythmic sentence of our current existence is punctuated by the energy crisis. We are told that energy is scarce, expensive, and destructive. This is the ultimate legacy of the 1874 textbooks. By deleting the atmospheric energy technology of Tartaria, the controllers created a world of artificial scarcity. They decoupled the human spirit from the infinite power of the ether and plugged it into a meter. Every bill you pay is a reminder of the 1874 theft. The massive chimneys of the old world factories were not for venting smoke. They were atmospheric extractors. The red brick used in almost every industrial building of the 1800s is high in iron oxide, making it an ideal material for magnetic energy storage. We are living inside a giant dead battery, and we are paying the people who killed it for the privilege of staying warm. Not a utility, not a service, a ransom. The investigative essayist must eventually look at the great reset of the mid-19th century as a biological event as much as a political one. The 1874 textbooks introduced a version of Darwinism that reduced the human experience to a struggle for survival. This was a calculated blow to the collective psyche. If we are just animals, we have no divine right to the Earth's energy. If we are just accidents of evolution, then the loss of our history doesn't matter. This survival of the fittest narrative provided the moral cover for the destruction of the Tartarian remnants. They weren't destroying a superior civilization, they were just evolving past it. The staccato beat of the factory clock replaced the harmonic pulse of the earth, and the sombre, unsettling tone of modern life began. We are a species with a suppressed heart rate, living in a frequency of fear. The maps of 1874 show a world divided into neat coloured blocks of empires: the British, the Russian, the French. These were the administrative zones of the victors. The great game was the process of dividing the Tartarian spoils. The wars of the 19th century, the Crimean War, the American Civil War, the Taiping Rebellion, were not separate conflicts. They were the mop-up operations of a global coup. The massive use of total war tactics, including the burning of cities and the destruction of records, was necessary to clear the stage for the 1874 textbooks to be written. The victors didn't just win a war, they won the right to define what the war was about. They turned a global revolution into a series of disconnected regional disputes, not a war, not a conflict, a liquidation. The intellectual provocation of this investigation lies in the realization that the 1874 textbooks are still being written. Every time a new history book is published, the erasure is reinforced. Every time an ancient site is restored with concrete and rebar, the evidence is buried deeper. The institutional gatekeepers are tireless because the truth is persistent. The Tartarian resonance still vibrates in the old stones. It still hums in the air during a lightning storm. It still whispers to the children who wonder why the old buildings look so much more alive than the new ones. Ask yourself, what happens when the 1874 narrative finally fails? What happens when the mud is cleared away and the buried windows are opened? The loop is not yet closed. The philosophical open loop of the 1874 erasure is the question of who is the they. We see the hand of the administrator, the censor, and the revisionist. We see the shadow of an organization that spans generations and borders. But the who is less important than the why. Why go to such lengths to hide a civilization? Why spend centuries maintaining a lie? Perhaps because the knowledge of Tartaria is the knowledge of our own power. If we knew what we were once capable of, we would no longer accept the limitations of our current reality. The 1874 textbooks were not just books, they were spell. They were a hypnotic suggestion that we are small, weak, and alone. Breaking that spell is the first step toward reclaiming the world. The investigation does not end with a discovery. It begins with an awakening. The institutional gatekeeping of the post-1874 era found its most potent weapon in the standardized museum. Before the 1870s, cabinets of curiosities were chaotic, eclectic collections that often displayed artifacts of the Tartarian world alongside natural wonders, without the rigid filtering of the modern curator. After 1874, the great museums, the Louvre, the British Museum, the Metropolitan, became the cathedrals of the new narrative. They organized human history into a linear progression of stone, bronze, and iron ages, a staccato classification that forced every discovery into a pre-approved slot. Ask yourself why so many massive stone sarcophagi and oversized weaponry are tucked away in the basements of these institutions, never to see the light of air. Public exhibit. If the people of the past were smaller and less nourished than we are, why did they forge swords that no modern man can wield? Why did they build doorways 20 feet high for a population that supposedly averaged 5'6"? The 1874 textbooks gave us the evolution of man to explain away these discrepancies. They told us we were getting bigger and smarter, while the physical evidence suggested we were merely the shrunken remnants of a giant global caste. Not a museum, not a gallery, a storage facility for inconvenient truths. The rhythmic sentence of the 1874 reset also dictated the discovery of electricity. We are taught that Thomas Edison and Joseph Swan independently invented the light bulb in the late 1870s, a narrative that perfectly aligns with the final disappearance of Tartaria. But the investigation into the Grand Exposition photographs of the 1850s reveals cities already bathed in a wireless, brilliant glow. The arc lights of the mid-19th century did not require the massive coal-fired power plants or the sprawling wire grids that define our modern age. They utilized the atmospheric potential difference, the same energy that powers a lightning bolt, to create a permanent cold light. By 1874, this technology was being systematically replaced. The war of currents between Tesla and Westinghouse was a staged drama, a distraction to focus the public's attention on which type of metered electricity they would pay for, rather than the free energy they had just lost. The 1874 textbooks redefined ether as a myth and resonance as a curiosity. They turned the sky from a battery into a void, not an invention, not a breakthrough, a downgrade. Consider the Great Wall of China. In the geography primers issued before 1874, the maps of the region often showed the wall's defensive embrasures, the loops where archers stand facing toward the south, toward China itself. This implies that the wall was not built by the Chinese to keep the Tartars out, but by the Tartarians to keep the Chinese in. After the 1874 revision, the narrative was flipped. The wall was claimed by the new Qing administration as a national monument, and subsequent restorations have systematically altered the structure to support the modern claim. This is the erasure trope in its most physical form. If you cannot destroy the monument, you steal its history. They took the greatest fortification of the old world and turned it into a tourist attraction for the new one. Ask yourself why the mortar of the ancient wall contains traces of synthetic polymers that shouldn't have existed until the 20th century. What if the wall we see today is a 19th century reconstruction of a much older, more functional energy barrier? Not a wall, not a fence, a boundary line for a global partition. The sombre, unsettling atmosphere of the 1874 reset is perhaps most evident in the rise of the cemetery. Before the mid-19th century, the dead were often buried in small local plots or within the foundations of the community's architectural structures. The 1874 era saw the birth of the rural cemetery movement, where massive park-like necropolises were built on the outskirts of cities. These sites, such as Mount Auburn or Highgate, feature the same Greco-Roman and Egyptian architecture that we are told was revivalist. But look at the dates on the oldest stones. Many of these cemeteries were established exactly as the Tartarian population was being liquidated. They were the final repositories for the people who knew the truth. By moving the dead to these isolated, asceticized zones, the 1874 revisionists ensured that the ancestors were literally and figuratively removed from the daily life of the city. The 1874 textbooks then taught the children to view these places as romantic and historic, rather than the mass disposal sites of a displaced civilization, not a park, not a memorial, a data dump. The institutional gatekeeping extended into the very science of the stars. In 1874, the transit of Venus was observed with global fervour, an event used by the scientific establishment to fix the scale of the solar system. This was the moment the universe became a cold, dead vacuum of vast distances. The Tartarian understanding of the firmament, a resonant, interconnected dome of plasma and frequency, was discarded in favour of a heliocentric model that made the human experience feel insignificant and accidental. If you are a speck of dust on a rock hurtling through an infinite void, you are much easier to control than if you are a focal point of a conscious, energetic cosmos. The 1874 textbooks taught us to look at the stars and see distance rather than connection. They took our eyes off the horizon and put them in the dirt. Not a discovery, not a measurement, a psychological grounding. The intellectual provocation of this fifth part lies in the realization that our industrial world is actually a parasitic one. We are not creating new energy. We are burning the remains of the old world to produce a fraction of the power our ancestors once pulled from the air. The 1874 textbooks are the manuals for this parasitic existence. They teach us how to be efficient scavengers. They teach us that the smoke from the factories is the smell of progress, when it is actually the smell of a dying planet's breath. What if the global warming of the modern era is not just the result of CO2, but the result of our disconnection from the Earth's natural cooling grid? What if the mud flood was the Earth's own immune response to the hijacking of its energetic nervous system? The investigation leads us to a tense, mysterious conclusion. We are living inside a wound. The staccato rhythm of the 1874 administrative record shows a sudden obsession with standardization. Everything from the gauge of the railroad tracks to the size of a screw was unified across the globe. We are told this was for the convenience of trade, but standardization is also the ultimate tool of erasure. By forcing every culture into the same physical and economic template, the unique, resonant technologies of the Tartarian world were made non-compliant. If your energy harvester doesn't fit the new British Standard socket, it is obsolete. If your building doesn't follow the new fire codes, which were often written to mandate the removal of atmospheric antennas, it is condemned. The 1874 textbooks were the user agreements for a world that had been hacked. We clicked accept without reading the fine print, and in doing so, we signed away our history. As an investigator, I look at the Statue of Liberty gifted to the United States in the years following the 1874 reset. We are told it is a symbol of freedom, a beacon for the huddled masses. But look at the crown, look at the torch. It is the iconography of the light bearer, the same Promethean figure that appears in the heraldry of the secret societies that managed the 1874 transition. She stands on a star fort, the fortwood on Bedloe's Island, a decommissioned Tartarian node. She is not a welcome sign, she is a victory monument. She is the warden of the new world, ensuring that the orphans arriving by ship would never look back at what they had lost. The 1874 textbooks gave us the poem to hide the power, not a gift, not a symbol, a seal. The philosophical open loop of this section remains. If the world was standardized in 1874, what was the standard that was lost? What was the original rhythm of human life before it was broken into the hours, minutes, and seconds of the factory clock? The more we dig into the archives, the more we find that the Tartarian world was not a centralized empire in the modern sense, but a decentralized network of resonant communities, held together not by laws, but by frequency. When they broke the frequency, the network collapsed. The 1874 textbooks were the static that ensured we would never find the signal again. But the signal is still there, vibrating in the iron of the old bridges and the glass of the old cathedrals. Ask yourself if you can hear it. What if the tinnitus of the modern world is actually the muffled scream of the old one? The investigation now moves toward the financial architecture of the 1874 reset, the creation of the debt-based economy that replaced the free energy of the Tartarian world. They didn't just take our past, they mortgaged our future. The 1874 textbooks taught us how to count money, but they made us forget how to count stars. The next step is to follow the gold, the massive, unaccounted for wealth of the Tartarian vaults that vanished in 1874, only to reappear as the capital of the new central banks. The financial architecture of the 1874 reset was not a development of commerce. It was a total enclosure of the human potential. Before this year, the wealth of the Tartarian world was not measured in debt or paper, but in the tangible output of an atmospheric energy surplus. There was no cost to power a city when the building itself was the generator. There was no poverty in a society where infrastructure was a public utility of the ether, but the 1874 textbooks introduced the concept of the gold standard as an absolute truth, a psychological anchor that tethered the value of human labor to a scarce, hoarded metal. Ask yourself why the central banks of the world, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the Reichsbank, all share the same fortress-like Tartarian architecture. They are the vaults for the stolen heritage of a global civilization. They took the gold that once gilded the domes of the atmospheric collectors and locked it in the dark, using it as collateral for a debt that can never be paid. Not a bank, not a treasury, a ransom house. The institutional gatekeeping of this era also saw the birth of the corporation as a legal person, a ghostly entity that could hold property and escape accountability. This was the mechanism used to claim the abandoned Tartarian infrastructure. If a city was found half buried in the mud or a star fort was discovered in the wilderness, it didn't belong to the people. It belonged to a chartered company. The 1874 textbooks taught us to respect these corporate titles as the natural order of progress. They turned the public commons of the old world into private assets. The rhythmic sentence of the stock ticker became the new pulse of the world, replacing the harmonic resonance of the earth with the erratic, anxious vibration of the market. They didn't just colonize the land, they colonized the concept of ownership itself. What if the Great Depressions of history were simply the periods when the controllers were recalibrating the harvest of our labor? Not a cycle, not a crash, a collection. Consider the post office. In the years surrounding 1874, the postal networks of the world were unified under the Universal Postal Union. We are told this was a triumph of communication. But look at the buildings. The old post offices in cities like Washington, D.C. or Sydney are massive, ornate palaces that feature the recurring Tartarian motifs, the clock towers, the copper spires, and the subterranean vaults. Why does a system for moving paper letters require the architectural weight of a fortress? What if these were the original communication nodes of the Tartarian wireless telegraph, a system that didn't need wires or batteries, but utilized the resonant frequency of the earth? The 1874 reset stripped these buildings of their high technology function and turned them into warehouses for paper. They replaced the instant communication of the old world with the slow mail of the new one, ensuring they could monitor and control the flow of information. Not a service, not a network, a filter. The investigative essayist must confront the theosophical movements that arose in the wake of 1874. Figures like Helena Blavatsky began to speak of root races and lost continents like Lemuria and Atlantis. While this might seem like an attempt to preserve the old knowledge, it was actually a sophisticated form of disinformation. By packaging the history of Tartaria into the realm of the occult and the mystical, the 1874 revisionists ensured that no serious academic would ever touch it. They turned a physical, technological reality into a spiritual fantasy. If you talk about a global empire in 1850, you are a historian. If you talk about it after 1874, you are a mystic or a madman. This is the erasure trope at its most devious. You don't have to burn the books if you can make people embarrassed to read them. They hid the truth behind a veil of incense and chanting, not a revival, not a hidden wisdom, a controlled leak designed to discredit the evidence. The somber, unsettling reality of our modern science is that it is built on a series of fundamental constants that were fixed in the late 19th century. The speed of light, the gravitational constant, the Planck length. These are the bars of our intellectual cage. The 1874 textbooks taught us that these numbers are immutable, but what if they are variables? What if the laws of physics changed when the Tartarian energy grid was dismantled? If you change the resonant frequency of the planet, you change the way matter behaves. The miracles and magic of the ancient world were simply the physics of a high resonance environment. By 1874, the world had been detuned, and the new, lower frequency physics were codified as the only reality. We are like musicians who have been told that only 3 notes exist, and we are trying to understand a symphony we can no longer hear. Not a law, not a fact, a setting. The staccato rhythm of the compulsory education laws enacted in the 1870s was the final nail in the coffin of the old world's memory. For the first time in history, the state claimed the right to the minds of children for 8 hours a day, every day. The 1874 textbooks were the curriculum of this mental colonization. They taught the children to look at the massive stone ruins of their own cities and see modern achievements. They taught them to look at the orphan trains as an act of mercy. They taught them to forget the names of their grandfathers and the language of the stars. This was the standardization of the soul. By the time those children grew up, the world of Tartaria was not just gone, it was impossible. The amnesia was complete. Not a school, not a classroom, a factory for the production of consent. The investigative eye looks at the Paris Commune of 1871 and the subsequent reconstruction of the city under Haussmann. They tell us the narrow streets were widened to prevent barricades and improve airflow. But look at the map of Paris before and after. The new boulevards were laid out in a series of geometric patterns that mirror the star faults, lines of power and resonance that were intended to redirect the city's energy into the new administrative centres. They didn't beautify Paris, they rewired it. The 1874 textbooks then celebrated this as the birth of modern urbanism. They turned the city from a living organism into a circuit board for the state. Ask yourself why every major capital in the world underwent a similar modernization at exactly the same time. Not a renovation, not a plan, a reconfiguration of the grid. The intellectual provocation of this sixth part is the realization that we are living in a temporary world. The buildings we build today have a lifespan of 50 years. The buildings of the Tartarian world lasted for thousands. The economy we participate in is based on the consumption of finite resources. The Tartarian world was based on the utilization of infinite ones. We are told that we are the most advanced civilization to ever exist, yet we cannot even maintain the infrastructure that was left behind for us. The 1874 textbooks were the first manuals of planned obsolescence. They taught us to value the new over the enduring. They taught us to be satisfied with the plastic and the plywood, while the stone and the copper were hidden under layers of paint and plaster. Not a peak, not a summit, a plateau of mediocrity. The philosophical open loop that remains is the question of the reset. If 1874 was the last great erasure, are we due for another? The patterns of the mid-19th century, the social unrest, the pandemics, the technological shifts, the rewriting of the maps are all reappearing in our own time. Is the digital age merely the next layer of the mask? Are the smart cities of the future just the final stage of the enclosure that began with the star forts? The 1874 textbooks are being updated again, and once again we are being told that the past is a dark, primitive place that we should be glad to leave behind, but the investigator knows better. The past is not behind us, it is beneath us, vibrating in the foundations of the world. The search for the 1874 fracture is a search for the moment we lost our autonomy. It is the moment the citizen was replaced by the subject. When you look at your tax bill, your electric bill, and your birth certificate, you are looking at the legacy of the 1874 reset. You are looking at the chains of a ghost empire that still rules from the shadows of the archives. The question is not whether Tartaria existed. The question is whether we have the courage to remember it. The next step is to examine the polar regions, the areas of the map that were whitewashed in 1874, where the remnants of the old world grid may still be active.